Evolution.org, episode 618 is coming your way. Today we're talking about what is the correct BPC-157 dose post-injury. So this one we're going to go over what BPC is, first of all. And I've seen a lot of people, Mobster, talking about BPC. They've been asking me about BPC lately. So obviously this is becoming popular, not just from social media, but also word of mouth. We're also going to talk about different weight training and cardio injuries that we've experienced and we've seen over the years. And then based on that, we're going to talk about how to dose BPC and get the most out of it. So, first off, with peptides, let's talk about BPC 157. Look, there are almost 10,000 natural peptides that are out there that are in our body. And peptides are short chain amino acids. So they're the building blocks of more complex proteins. So you've got all kinds of reasons for these to exist. You can talk about when it comes to regulating our hormones, when it comes to our immune system, when it comes to fighting off infections, nerve signals transmitting, all kinds of different things. Peptides are essential to life. So if we didn't have these peptides, we would die. So it's very, very important. So what we've come to figure out in the bodybuilding world is we can use these peptides to our advantage. And there's tons of peptides. Now, originally, when peptides really started hitting the scenes in bodybuilding, there was a lot of growth hormone mimicking peptides. So instead of guys using growth hormone, they'd use the GHRPs, GHRHs, and those were the ones they would use. They would use them because they wanted to get those growth hormone benefits that come with growth hormone, the improvements in sleep and the lean muscle mass and the fat loss and the appetite improvements and all that good stuff. Well, with the other peptides now, that have become more popular, deal with all kinds of other things when it comes to mood and all kinds of things. We've seen peptides being used for immune system, specifically wound healing. I've seen all kinds of things, and you can come on the forum and check out some of our sources that sell so many different peptides. There's like tons of them now, so dozens and dozens of them. And there's very few people that really can go through and tell you, every 100 peptide that's out there, what it can be used for. So as we continue to study these, people are really starting to gain, they're starting to gain recognition. And one of the ones that I've used and had success with is BPC 157. And a lot of people that I've talked to in the fitness world outside of the forums and outside of the podcast have asked me about BPC. Where can I get it? I want to use it. A friend of mine at the gym has been using it and he recommended it for me. I have an injury and I want to use it. So this is what BPC came around. Now, BPC, very important to understand, it's naturally occurring protein. It's in human gastric juice. So, and it's called body protection compound, which is BPC, and it helps protect and repair tissue. So BPC is not only great for post-injury, but it's also great for preventing injury that you think you may be prone to. Maybe you had a prior knee injury, for example. You could start using the BPC ahead of time, and it can help with that. Or maybe you've suffered from elbow issues in the past or shoulder issues in the past, and you're starting to increase the amount of weights you're doing. So there's all kinds of different ways you can approach BPC. But on this specific podcast, we're going to go over specifically post-injury. And on the next segment, we're going to go over some weight training and cardio injuries that we've experienced. But first, let me bring in Mobster. Mobster, what are your thoughts on BPC so far? And what are the things you've been hearing?
So, talking to a buddy the other day, he reminded me there's a fellow over here that used to be part of the Mick Hart steroid thing called Paul Scarborough, and his nickname is PS Carb. And Paul probably brought up, probably by talking to other people, of course, the whole TB 500 BPC 157 thing almost 15, 20 years ago. And my buddy reminded me of this, and I was like, Jesus Christ, has it been around that long? So, like Steve said, you still get healing benefits just using growth hormone. So it can be confusing. But over the years, and I've mentioned this on similar shows when we talked about recovery and specifically about BPC 157, I started to see probably 5 or 10 years ago, Steve. Small conversations here and there on people's logs, on the forums, and I thought the UK forums, never mind the Evo family of forums, the IO and so on and so forth, more and more positive. I've got an injury, I've had an injury, I'm trying to recover from an injury. And Steve talked to me in the pre show, which I'll get to in a minute, specific injuries that I've seen around the strongman, the strength community, and of course, bodybuilding. So, natural wear and tear, Steve, of the usual places, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And they discovered, directly or indirectly, these healing peptides, specifically BPC-157. The feedback was almost, I saw it, Steve, I'll say 100% great. It was either, the worst was it was only helped me a little bit, but the great and vast majority of comments used properly, used correctly, used effectively for the right dosages at the right period of time, and of course with rehab and recovery. Nearly every single time I was seeing recovery, nearly every single time I was seeing comments to the effect of, this has helped my injury, and recommending it to other people. Naturally, especially when it first came out, Steve, you were looking at issues with the correct. Was it what it said? Was it actually BPC 157? Was it correctly dosed? Was there something else in there? And so on and so forth. But even then, I was still seeing positive comments. Even then, I was still seeing people that were getting, making progress, recovering, and so on and so forth. So you and I have talked about the super, super importance of recovery. We see people hitting the gym sometimes 5, 6, 7 days a week. Sometimes, even if they only hit the weights, they're still physically active the rest of the time. And there's also an element of, and you can exclude some of our younger listeners with their ability to bounce back. But the simple time that you guys sometimes spend 4 years, if you're serious, in the gym, getting in shape, like training, like working out, like testing your strength, like playing the sports that you play, and especially if you play to a high level, Steve, and that's regardless of whether it's weightlifting, bodybuilding, basketball, whatever. And I've talked about this as well. When I've done world record stuff, the risk of me getting injured doing what I love to do is high. And whether that's wear and tear, pounding away, repetitive strain, whatever, at some point, the risk factor, it will kick in and you're going to get a tweak, you're going to get a pain. And the idea that there's something out there that's going to help us has to explain the popularity. Prices are arguably better than they've been. They've come down in terms of availability. There's more applications. It isn't all just injection, although we're talking about dosages for injection today. We will talk about other things as well slightly, we refer to. And again, I'm at that point, Steve, certainly in the past with my competitive nature, I've been around very strong, very muscular individuals, 350, 300, some of them 400 fucking pounds, doing world-class feats of strength, not just in my niche, but in actual televised strongman competitions, etc. And I can think of several that have had what have been in the past, the career-ending injuries, and the ability to recover from those injuries, the ability to come back and even win British and European championships. And one example that I'm thinking of right now, post-injury, is amazing. Think some of the favourite sports before I hand this back to Steve. I'll challenge Steve now. Think of 15 or 20 years ago, some of your favourite athletes, Steve, in basketball, baseball, and American football, where they had injuries that they would not have recovered from, that they do now recover from, both in terms of surgery, but also rehab, recovery, and specifically these healing peptides, that these are people's careers that they're able to keep going, where previously that would have been a game over. What do you think on that before we move on?
Yeah, and we've come a lot when it comes to sports medicine, and we've had to because these teams are investing multi-millions of dollars in these players. They want these players to come back. They're paying them all this money, all this guaranteed money. They're signing them to these big contracts, and that depends on them coming back as soon as possible. So they're going to use everything that they can in their book. And BPC is one of those that, because it is naturally in the body, It's one of those that it's a really good option for you to try. Now, I've used BPC myself on many, many different types of injuries. And look, at the end of the day, you got to remember what it does. It's going to speed up recovery. So if you have a devastating injury, let's say you tear your ACL or something. It's a huge injury. You're not going to heal your ACL by injecting some BPC into your knee. Okay? That's not what it's all about. But what it does do in that situation for catastrophic types of injuries or an Achilles or something like that, which would require even a professional athlete to be out for months and months and months, is it allows the healing process to be quicker. So you'd have your surgery, you go through your rehab process. During your rehab process, you take the BPC and it speed up recovery. And you said something interesting, Mobster. We definitely have seen a trend where guys are coming back at the professional level, whether it be bodybuilding or any sport, and they're coming back and having great seasons the next year after these types of injuries. Almost like the injury actually helped them because it gave them their body a little bit of a break because they've been pounding away at their body since they were 4 years old or 5 years old, playing whatever sport they're doing. Or with bodybuilding, you're pounding your body since you're 12 years old, 13 years old bodybuilding. And now you're forced to take a break because of the injury. And then you combine the excellent medical care that you're getting, that I hope you're getting, and you combine the BPC in there, and it will help speed up things. So, different injuries that I've experienced, I had a shoulder tear back in my mid 30s. And back when I had my shoulder tear, one of the things that happened was I didn't know that I tore my shoulder. So I kept pounding and pounding and pounding at it, and eventually what happened was the inflammation started going down my arm, and I started having nerve. My fingers were going numb, so the inflammation was going down my arm. It was pinching on the nerves, the ulnar nerve in my elbow. So the injuries just kind of compounded. And finally, I went to the doctor, and I'm like, doctor, what's wrong with me? Of course, in America, our healthcare system's a joke, not like it is in Europe. So in America, you can't just run to the doctor every time you have an issue. You kind of just have to just suck it up. So finally I went, I was like, doctor, I mean, I can't take it anymore. Like my whole right side of my arm is like numb. What the hell is going on here? And he's like, yeah, he's like, let's get a MRI done. So they did an MRI and they're like, yeah, you tore your shoulder. He's like, I see this shit all the time. You guys are nuts. You guys don't want to take a break. And I was like, no wonder when I was doing bench presses, my right arm was weaker than my left arm because I tore my shoulder. I didn't even know I tore my shoulder. So I used BPC. I got BPC and I started injecting it into my shoulder. But I also combined that with taking a break from doing anything that irritated my shoulder. That includes inclines, militaries, obviously, and even bench press. I had to take time away from those. And I had to work on mobility work. I had to work on flexibility work. So BPC works infinitely better when you're combining rest, rehab, mobility, and stretching, and getting things back to where they should be. And that's how you're going to get the most out of BPC. So that was my experience with BPC. And today, look, at the end of the day, will I ever be able to lift heavy again? Maybe. But my physical therapist pretty much told me you're never going to be able to lift the kind of weights you were before. Because if you do, you risk tearing it way worse and requiring surgery. So that was my experience with BPC. I also use BPC on different things. Elbows, doing a lot of pull-ups, high volume training, really ended up with some chronic elbow issues. So I injected some BPC into my elbows. It really got it going. I've used BPC on my back. I've used BPC on my neck. You want to really be careful, obviously. You don't want to be injecting into your spine, but you want to get it as close to the injury as possible when it comes. We're going to talk about it in the next segment. But, Mobster, what are some of the injuries that you've seen over the years in the
Yeah,
weight room?
right. So, as I said earlier, Steve, I've been around some very high end, and as I said on other shows, we're talking about people at the world's strongest man level have literally competed with Brian Shaw and Mark Felix in a rolling thunder competition prior to prior to Brian Shaw winning the world's strongest man. I trained with and competed in grip competitions again with Lawrence Charlet. And both Lawrence, Brian, ironically, less so, but Lawrence and another British athlete who'd been on the podium multiple times and probably competed and managed to hit the top 10, the most out of any British athlete, Terry Hollands, both, I believe, had bicep tears. And again, what we're looking at here, whether it's strength or bodybuilding or whatever else, is you're pushing yourself to the nth degree. So in powerlifting, we've seen quad tears, to a lesser degree, hip strains and minor hip tears. But the one, again, shoulders injuries we see a lot of in bodybuilders, whether that's poor form, for example, press behind neck can be terrible in a rotator cuff. We sometimes see people doing far too high of a volume or far too many exercises trying to beef up their shoulders, and it's all around the rotator cuff. Same again with bench pressing and powerlifting. But specifically, these two athletes stand out in my mind as having bicep tears. I'll talk about briefly the NHS approach. Steve's correct in some way, because of course we have private medical insurance, but it's not a prerequisite. We have what's called the NHS. And the problem we've had, which is changing slowly, Steve, is that the NHS for years took the approach of function, meaning if you'd had a bicep tear, but you could still supinate your hand and lift your hand to your shoulder in the bicycle type position, you had function. And if you had function, why do we need to operate? Yes, you have a bicep tear, but you can still put food in your mouth. You can still, to put it crudely, scratch your ass. Now, of course, if you're a strength athlete and you literally make a living from appearances, from multiple shows, even if you don't place in the top three, you're still earning some income, qualifying sometimes by virtue of those appearances in multiple competitions, by being chosen to go to the world's strongest man, even though you didn't get first, second, or third, and so on and so forth, then literally your living or your ability to compete at the highest level relies on your ability for your body to perform at a certain particular level. And in the case of these two individuals, like Steve said, it was almost a godsend because they had to take something like 3, 4, 5 months, 3 months is the minimum, to go away and relearn and get function and so on and so forth. One of the things we did in the sport was we found that if you went to one hospital and they realized that you had function and they wasn't willing to operate, or if they did, it wasn't prioritized and might take ages, and the sooner you operated on, the better. We said, right, go to another hospital. And I've known of athletes go to 4 different hospitals before they found a willing surgeon or consultant that would allow them and understood that a person was an athlete. And this is actually, especially in bodybuilding, see the aesthetics. We know about Dorian Yates' biceps tear. If you have no bicep, as we like to say in bodybuilding, what the fuck are you doing on stage? So therefore, you need your muscles to look a certain way. And especially at professional level, in terms of the strength side, we need for your ability to do certain exercises, for example, the lifting log and some of the thick axle stuff that we see on the television. And some of that involves the bicep. A lot of bicep tears are ironically done in either the deadlift with double overhand versus actually the mixed grip. Now, a lot of new straps use double overhand because it's less stressful. Or the Atlas stones, where you're picking up a lump of rock or concrete, sometimes in excess of 200 kilograms, that's 440 pounds, with your arms outstretched and with an enormous amount of tension on your bicep. And so, of course, your bicep is actually part of the movement. So getting surgery and recovering from surgery or injury is super important. And that's without you literally looking like there's something to hold them out with your arms and so on and so forth, which is super important to bodybuilding.
When you get
So,
older,
yeah,
when you're younger, these little nagging injuries that you can get, they'll
yes,
heal up on
yes,
their own and you can just
yes.
kind of work through them. But as you get older, things will start changing. I remember this guy on the forum years ago, this young guy, cocky guy, and he's talking about, oh, I just pushed through my injuries, pushed through my injuries, and say, look, it's going to work when you're young. This is why in pro sports, every year teams have a draft. They draft younger talent to come in and replace the older guys. Because the older guys, even though they're smarter, even though they have experience, their bodies break down. So they want the younger blood to come in that's fresh. So what happens is you pound, you pound, you pound. Eventually, those small injuries will become chronic, is what I mean to
Yeah,
say.
look, Steve, on the forums, if we take you and I could talk about high-end athletes, and I could just, as I just have. But let's go onto the forums, and I challenge the listener to do this and literally search for BPC-157 or recovering from injury as a search tool. The people that we're talking about are not high ends competing strength athletes, weightlifters, powerlifters, strongmen. They're very rarely, although they occasionally are, competing bodybuilders. They are just normal Joes that have had injuries that are listening to this show right now, and they are the ones that have put time under the iron. It's very, very rare. I said, I don't think I can think of a single example when it's been a young person. It's nearly always someone that goes to the gym, loves to train, loves to do curls, loves to press, loves to bench, wants to look a certain particular way. And I'm going to say 30 plus. And it's literally, and again, what about the analogy that I've used before, Steve, when I talked about a sports car? You want to think of your body sometimes as a sports car. And if you push it and push it and push it, something will happen. And if you're unlucky, it's going to be a bicep tear, it's going to be a quad tear, it's going to be a shoulder issue. And we've literally, just in the last couple of months, as we record this show in early 2025, there is a post-surgery thread on one of the forums where there are photographs of the internal stitching on that particular person's injury. So, look, the reality of the situation is, as we move on, Steve, is that you will sometimes have these issues come up. You have to understand you won't bounce back like a piece of rubber. To coin the phrase, you're not as young as you once were. And of course, even if you are young, there is still a risk. There are still potential injuries out there. So rest and rehab is
Yeah. So
absolutely.
don't think it won't happen to you, because
No,
eventually will, especially if you're pushing yourself. And that's
we've
just
talked about,
part, yeah.
Steve, how important recovery's become for high-end athletes, literally built into the program in a way it never was before. But let's focus specifically here. The ability for healing peptides, and specifically what BPC 157, to aid in that recovery and to help you recover and just to lengthen your career, to enable you to return to the gym. Who wants a I can't train ever again kind of injury? No one. No one listening to this
So
show. You're all hardcore motherfuckers who want to hit back in the gym.
so it's not about dosing. And this is a very important one. Now, there's several different ways I've seen BPC being sold by legitimate places. There's a spray, there's capsules, and there's, of course, the old-fashioned way of getting it in powder form and having to reconstitute it. So, in my experience, I've used the reconstituted, taking the and injecting it into the injury as my ways of doing it, and that is the best way to use it. But the sprays also have been shown to work. The capsules have been shown to work. One of your buddies came on the podcast about a month ago, and he's been taking the capsules, and he swears by it.
Yep,
So
yep.
those are great options. Now, the standard dose of BPC, no matter how you take it, is 250 micrograms. But here's the thing: if you are dealing with multiple injuries, and one of the cool things about BPC is that it's not like a drug where you're gonna like overdose on it. Um, one of the things you want to make sure you do, obviously, is you want to use it within reason, because too much of anything isn't good. And there are anything in life you take too much of, it can have negative consequences on you and be counterproductive. So you don't want to just go take BPC, a bunch of BPC, and just inject it into an injury. That's not the way we want to do it. We want to keep it. And BPC isn't the cheapest thing in the world either, especially considering how long you should be running it. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But let's say you get the powder form and you reconstitute. That's the most popular way to use any peptide. And with BPC 157, and Mobster and I were touching on the pre-show, the way I attacked BPC 157 is I would do the first week 500 micrograms every other day. Let's say in my shoulders example that I talked about earlier, I was doing 500 micrograms every other day, deep into my shoulder, as deep as I could go. Even though I was using a sling pen, you could also use a 1 inch and go deeper with a 1 inch needle. But I was using a 29 gauge half inch needle. So I'd load the syringe and I'd inject it as close to the injury as possible and kind of rotate around where the injury is. So if it's in your elbow, you want to kind of try to get it as close to where it hurts as possible, but kind of rotate around, you know, a millimeter here, millimeter there, centimeter here, centimeter there, whatever, just to get it close to where it is and kind of just circle the wagon on that. Make sure it's in there. And then after a week or two, you can reduce the dose to 250 micrograms every other day and so on. And then over time, you want to just stick to a maintenance dose if it's a problem area. So overall, you really want to give BPC a solid 2 to 3 months to really do its magic. And absolutely, stacking it is a smart choice and doing everything that I talked about earlier, the rehab work, the mobility work, the flexibility work. Mobility and flexibility is your enemy in bodybuilding because we build a lot of muscle, we get less flexible in the process. And if you are a person who went into bodybuilding not very flexible, you're going to get even less flexible. And if you went in flexible, you're going to get less flexible. If you played sports ever since you were a kid, you go out for the practice. It's standard to warm up and stretch. I remember even when I played soccer, okay? And I'm not saying soccer, and I'm not downgrading soccer, but I'm just giving you an example. But in soccer, even before practice, we'd sit around for 15, 20 minutes and stretch. And then we go for a little run or we go in scrimmage or whatever. Football, same thing. You're getting bent every which direction. It's important to stretch. Basketball, it's important to stretch. It prevents injury. So in bodybuilding, people don't stretch enough. Why? I have no clue. It's just they're so fucked up in the head that they think stretching is not manly or something. I have no clue, mobster, but stretching is absolutely important. So you
I
got to be,
think, Steve, I think we don't realize how important these things are until we get injured.
yeah,
Then suddenly the
post,
penny drops.
but I just want to say this post weight training, that's when you
Yeah,
want to stretch. You could do some stretching prior, but you definitely want to warm up prior. But save the deep stretching till after. Save the yoga poses till after, because if you stretch before you weight train, you're gonna it's that's not correct. You should wait till after to do the deep stretching. So that's very, very important. A lot of people don't realize that. So even if you are stretching and you get injured, like Steve, you told me to stretch when I got injured. No, I didn't tell you to stretch before. I told you to stretch after. But people don't know that. They weight train, they pick their shit up out of the locker room and they leave and they go
yeah.
home. That's not correct. You've got to stretch. If you want to leave, leave, but go home and stretch. But I always like to stretch at the gym, and it's a nice way to kind of get the body more loose. So it's
Oh,
very important.
very quickly, Steve, you love the hot yoga, which is definitely a way of stretching after the gym, and that's something that Steve's
Yeah.
been doing for quite a while. It's super important. Let me just add here, Steve, when it comes to the pill, the gels, the sprays versus the injectable, in terms of dosaging, I tend towards the idea, and I would like to see science perhaps argue against this. This is fine, but for now, the injectable is the most direct and effective and works the best, let's put it in those terms, because it's going to the site of injury. And therefore, the dosing that Steve suggests is on point for that particular reason. The pill is less direct for obvious reasons. And I would argue even less so is the topical sprays or gels. And so, for example, I believe the minimum dosage I've seen in the pill form is 500 micrograms, purely and simply because how much of that is going to be absorbed and end up at the site of injury. Both of those tend to be more generalized. So you might want to think in terms of higher dosage for the pill and or the topical applications, purely and simply because the part of the higher dosage that's effective in order to be comparable to the injectable version will be less. So therefore you'll need to use more to get the same dosage working at the site of injury. And Steve, I will finish by saying Steve is correct again. It's very easy to get into the mindset of, I'll do 12 weeks. With the longer you spend recovering, the more rehab you do, and this is for any kind of athlete, and I've spoken about this before, the better. Just as an example, Stephen, I literally had a conversation with a woman in the gym today that had both her knees replaced. And I said I'd spoken to ex-amateur rugby players, men, with scars on their knees, and every athlete, including herself, that had done the rehab, the recovery religiously, to the full extension as recommended by the person giving them the rehab, the physiotherapist, had the best recovery. Those that cut it short because it was uncomfortable or painful got the less of the result that they wanted. Combining this with BPC-157 is the way to go. Please note, as always, we are not doctors and the opinion are ours. It's our view and based on our experience and views on the topic. A podcast for informational purposes, entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.